In many ways, Thomas More is one of the most attractive figures of the Renaissance. He was a scholar, he was a practical politician and statesman, and he was also a martyr who was killed by Henry VIII on account of certain political and religious disputes. What he's most known for nowadays is the fact that he authored Utopia, which is one of the great works in the tradition of Western political thought. It narrates or describes what an ideal society would be like from the perspective of a believing Christian at the time of the Renaissance. In many respects, it is a recapitulation and encapsulation of the Western tradition of political theory. Now, like his friend Erasmus, Thomas More was remarkable for his tolerance and conservatism, not in the sense that you might think of conservatism today, but rather in his reluctance to change. Not specifically with reference to particular political issues, but mostly his religious conservatism. He maintained his position as a believing Catholic during the earlier stages of the Lutheran Reformation, and he wrote books against Luther, but for the most part he was not the most strident of Luther's critics. In fact, like Erasmus, he attempted throughout most of his career to find a sort of middle ground, which would allow for the Catholic Church to be changed internally and at the same time not generate religious schism and religious war, which is what he and Erasmus were both afraid of. So I would describe him as a religiously motivated conservative, not with reference to particular political decisions, but more in a general sense with reference to larger religious issues. He was very personally pious. He was a man remarkable for his own virtue, for the fact that as a politician he was extremely honest, and yet at the same time he was very much afraid of change. I would say that Thomas More has in mind in his Utopia a static society which is immune to change. In some ways, Thomas More thinks that a good society is one which will be immune to history. Now, while working for Henry VIII, he was the Chancellor of England, and when the Lutheran Reformation began, when Luther began writing criticisms of things like the Catholic Church or the Catholic sacraments, Henry, because he was still in the good graces of the Pope, and the Pope was still in his good graces, attempted to support Catholicism, and rather than writing books against Luther himself, because Henry VIII would have been largely incapable of such a thing, he had Thomas More write these books and then claimed the authorship himself. So the book called 1521, called The Defense of the Seven Sacraments, which is directed against Luther, is in fact the product of Thomas More. It's not the product of Henry VIII. If you knew what Henry VIII was like historically, he would not be a likely choice for a book called The Defense of the Seven Sacraments. Now, what is important about Thomas More is the fact that he represents a sort of summation of the tradition of Western political thought and moral thought, and he's trying to braid together the traditions that come out of Jerusalem and Athens, taking what is best in both, and yet maintaining a fidelity to the tradition that comes out of Jerusalem over the tradition that comes out of Athens. In other words, God wins all ties. All right, so he's trying to braid Athens and Jerusalem together, and Utopia, which is his most famous work, borrows directly and heavily from the tradition of Greek political thought in particular. In the first case, he is obviously indebted to Plato. He is indebted to Plato because much of Utopia is derived from the Republic. There are also deviations from the scheme that Plato offered in the Republic, but first of all, the idea of an ideal society, the concept of a perfect world, a perfect political order in which all change has been eliminated and in which everything is operating according to its best capacity. That's something that he does borrow from Plato, a sort of otherworldly tendency, a tendency to criticize this world by ideal standards. That's certainly something that he has in common with Plato. In addition to that, in Utopia, Thomas More makes other concessions to the Platonic tradition, things like feminism. He allows women to get the same education as men. They are both responsible for running the state, but in particular for defending the state if it is attacked. In addition to that, like Plato, More in his Utopia abolishes private property. And this is a more important issue than you might immediately suspect from reading the book. Well, I'll come back towards the end of the lecture to the question of private property and private ownership. But Thomas More advocated a sort of communism. He wanted to abolish money, and he wanted to abolish commerce. He thought commerce and money had a bad ethical influence on society. Like Plato, he thought that it distracted people's attention, distracted people's passions, and caused internal strife to a political order. So in some ways, because Thomas More is writing Utopia in 1516, right, the Renaissance is well underway, the era of the nation-state is here, the new world has been found. The idea of abolishing commerce, the idea that commerce is leading us down the road to perdition, is, in the pejorative sense, utopian. Right, in the sense that you could never possibly eliminate that. But what's important about Thomas More is that he can see that the changes that Western culture is undergoing, changes in not just in their understanding of geography in the world, but changes in science, changes in religion, and religious schism are all leading us away from a blessed political and moral state. Thomas More wants to bring us back to that. He does not intend utopia as a real live possibility. In other words, he doesn't think that we could change England either this year or 100 years from now and turn it into something that's utopian. Like Plato's Republic, More's Utopia is intended as a sort of yardstick. We may not find anything in this world that's perfectly 1 yard long, but the yardstick will allow us to figure out how long an individual thing that we find in the world is. Plato wants us to use his Republic as a kind of political yardstick that we measure the various real political orders by, and that we can find in what respect they are deficient. Well, Thomas More intends utopia to be used in quite the same way. He does not anticipate that this world would become perfect, that we could have a utopian society. But utopia does give the Christian humanist a standard by which to look around at the contemporary governments in the world and find them lacking. So that's the key question here. You have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. That is the way More looks at contemporary political order. And his way of articulating that is to give us this new utopian construct. Now, in addition to borrowings from Plato, and you should not only look at Plato's Republic, those of you that want to trace out the intellectual genealogy, the intellectual lineage of Thomas More's Utopia, I would emphasize that you should have a look at Plato's Laws as well. Plato changed his political thinking quite considerably from the middle period in which he writes the Republic to the end of his life. The last dialogue is called the Laws. It's also one of the longest of the dialogues. That is an attempt to reformulate his conception of political order. And in Plato's Laws, many concessions are made to the imperfections of human nature, which More lifts wholesale from that part of Plato. So if you're looking to find the origin of some of More's ideas here, I would suggest that you go back and look at the Laws, not just the Republic. Now, in addition to borrowing from Plato, we also find that More borrows from Aristotle. And of course, in some ways you can't avoid borrowing from Aristotle because he's such a pervasive influence on the Western tradition, particularly on the tradition of Western Christianity in the Middle Ages. So he borrows from Aristotle, for example, ideas like the mean. Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics emphasizes that virtue is a mean between two vices. What he means by that is that extremes of human conduct are the ones that get us into trouble. And More takes that idea and says, for the most part, and he keeps this consistent with his conception of sin and God's conception of right and wrong, but for the most part, Aristotle is right in More's view. And the most important example in Utopia, where More adopts an Aristotelian position, is in the way in which religion is presented. In More's Utopia, in this utopian society, there are a plurality of religious beliefs, and people are not persecuted on account of their religion. And of course, this is an implicit criticism of the entire state of Western Europe and the tradition of Western Christianity. People should not be persecuted for their religious beliefs. And More says it only drives people into hypocrisy, and then you have a worse problem. Then you have hypocrites buried within your church. Far better for you to allow people to say what they have on their mind and not persecute them for that. And in some ways, that's a highly religious idea. Well, More says, look, it would be a problem in an ideal society if we had people who were atheists. In Utopia, atheists are looked upon with great disfavor, but they are not burned, they are not imprisoned or tortured, or they don't have any punishment inflicted on them. Atheists are prohibited from holding public office, and they're also prohibited from giving testimony because you have to swear by God, and if you don't believe in God, then it seems to undercut the force of an oath. Key thing for More, though, in his view of atheism, is that that would be an example of transgressing the Aristotelian mean, from a moderate amount of religious zeal and religious insight to none whatever. Remember what Aristotle said, virtue is a mean between two vices? Well, it's very important then for us to avoid atheism, not just because it endangers our soul and prevents salvation, but also because in a purely pagan, rational way, it is an unacceptable approach to divinity. On the other hand, and this is a very important thing that can be gleaned out of the text of Utopia, too much religious zeal is a sin, is an evil. conflicts with Aristotle's idea of the mean, but it also conflicts with true Christian piety. And this is quite a remarkable observation from Thomas More. Remember, first of all, he's a Catholic saint. Sanctity is not foreign to him. He's an extremely holy and honest individual. In addition to that, he was a martyr. He died rather than give up his religious principles. For that reason, it is quite surprising, perhaps in some ways paradoxical, for us to find that he thinks that an excess of religious zeal is an evil, is a transgression. And the example he gives is this. The island of Utopia, which is where this ideal society is in fact an island, when it first gets its initial introduction to Christianity, some of the people take it with an unreasonable and unacceptable and unchristian amount of zeal, and they begin to become persecuting, bullying, hectoring people who are constantly threatening other people with their sinfulness, threatening them with God's condemnation and with eternal damnation. They are causing a civil disturbance, and here More steps in and says, or in Utopia says, I approve of the Utopian magistrate who had that man punished, who had him taken out of the public sphere, and had forced him to, not to recant his religious beliefs, but to hold his religious beliefs with a greater degree of moderation. Think about what the context of Renaissance Europe is. There are plenty of Catholic heresies and schisms within the Church, and we are only a year or two from the development of Lutheranism, which is going to be a tremendous schism, and then the entire Protestant Reformation. What More is saying here is that virtue is a mean between two vices, even when it comes to religion. Too little religion is a gross and obvious evil, but he emphasizes that too much religion is, and that in fact a proper understanding of religion makes people more peaceful, more sociable, more docile and social in that respect. When people begin to hector others, when they adopt the position of Savonarola, then they go past the boundary, go past the Aristotelian mean, and then properly, even without the insight of Scripture, it is proper for the Utopian magistrate to punish such a person. So that is only one of the many borrowings that More makes from the Aristotelian tradition. And that, if you stop and think about it, is quite a large concession. He will never let Aristotle or Plato interfere with his understanding of biblical religion or Christianity. But insofar as they overlap, and in More's view, being a Christian humanist, because he wants to be from the tradition of Athens and Jerusalem, insofar as they overlap, he is more than willing to tip his hat to the classical tradition. And for that reason, he makes his arguments accessible and plausible to a far wider audience than he would have otherwise. Now, in addition to pulling, say, this idea of the golden mean from Aristotle, there's also the idea of the family. This is something Plato left out of his Republic. If you remember the fact that he abolishes private property, but also abolishes the private family and the nuclear family. Aristotle says Plato is wrong. Aristotle says in the Politics that the family is the minimal unit of society. Well, More lifts that and takes it, because it's so much more consistent with Scripture and with Christian traditions, he lifts that right out of Aristotle's Politics and drops it into Utopia. So there are a good number of important borrowings from both Aristotle and Plato, and if you know the political thinking of both of these authors, it will make it a lot easier for you to understand what it is that More is choosing to lift from that tradition, choosing to borrow, and what he's leaving out. And in some cases, what he leaves out is as important as what he puts in, and I'll try and come to that a little bit later. But let me add a couple of more things that More does include in his borrowings from the classical tradition. In the first case, there's a very strong element of Epicureanism. Epicureanism is the philosophical doctrine that pleasure is the only good. Now, More adopts that, which is a strange thing for a Christian saint to adopt, but only up to a point, within the bounds of natural reason and also within the bounds of revealed religion. Epicureanism, pleasure is a good thing provided it meets both of those two standards. So, for example, in Utopia, the Utopian people like simple pleasures that are unmixed with any kind of sin. So they're fond of music, they're fond of flowers, they're fond of beautiful things, but this loving of beauty does not move to the level of vanity. Right? It is always simple and natural pleasures. So what he is doing in some respects is retreating from the tradition of Christian asceticism that we find in monasticism. Think about how important asceticism and the monastic tradition was in medieval Europe. More himself practiced considerable mortification of the flesh. He was quite an ascetic individual. But he said, look, asceticism would make no sense if it did not serve some divine purpose. And no divine purpose is served by abolishing the simple and natural pleasures which God has offered to human beings. So this is what I might call a balanced and harmonious conception of what human beings might become, limited always by a Christian understanding of right and wrong, and constrained by certain borrowings from the classical tradition. And yet, the way in which More fuses them is in some ways a very attractive kind of whole. And that is one of the nice things about More. It doesn't have quite the same level of otherworldliness that we saw in Meister Eckhart, for example, yet it is consistent with most of our basic intuitions about the human condition, that beauty is not a bad thing if it doesn't cause us to engage in any other transgression, that pleasure is not a bad thing so long as it isn't connected to sin. A very plausible set of arguments, and it turns out that More's utopians accept this pretty much in its totality. Now, in addition to Epicureanism, More's Utopia borrows from the tradition of Roman Stoicism. And what's important here is that, like Stoicism and Christianity, More's utopians are making cosmopolitan moral claims. In other words, for the Stoic philosopher, the cosmos is his polis. That's what makes him cosmopolitan. The world is his city. Well, he's a citizen of the universe, so are our utopians. They follow natural reason and natural law, and when they get access to revealed religion, they absorb it very readily because they are natural people whose naturally constructed system, whose reasonably constructed system, allows them to develop in an uncorrupted fashion, makes them likely vehicles for Christian faith. So it turns out that much has been borrowed from the tradition of Athens in Utopia. And still, the Athenian tradition, the tradition of Greek philosophy, is the junior partner in Utopia. In fact, the dominant majority partner is the tradition of intellectual and spiritual life that comes from Jerusalem. And there are a number of departures from the Athenian tradition that we see in this tradition from Jerusalem. The first and most obvious is the idea of sin. Plato, Aristotle don't talk much about sin. It's not within their vocabulary of moral discourse. And that leads, in More's view, to certain characteristic errors, particularly of the Platonists, for whom he has a very high regard. For example, in Plato's Republic, it is assumed that no one will ever do any evil. Once you have the form of the good, and the philosopher king knows what everyone is supposed to do, then he orders society properly, gives everyone a good education, and thereafter there's no evil and there's no transgression. More is far more realistic than that. He is not willing to believe that human beings are perfectible. And the belief that human beings are not perfectible is in fact another way of formulating the idea of original sin. If you think that people are perfectible, you are a Greek. If you think that human society cannot be perfected no matter how many laws we pass and no matter how many institutions we change, then, like it or not, one way or another, you believe in sin. More believes in sin, and he's willing to become quite explicit about it. His belief in sin means that he thinks people are not perfectible. The fact that they are not perfectible means that even in an ideal society, even in a utopia, it would be necessary to have things like courts and laws and judges, all of which are left out of Plato's Republic. There aren't any courts in Plato's Republic because nobody does anything wrong. More says, no, that is contrary to human nature. Human beings will do bad things no matter how you educate them, no matter what kind of society you draw up. You have to accept that fact. It is the human condition. This is a borrowing, not from Athens, but from Jerusalem. And this borrowing runs right to the core of his argument, because in addition to having laws and courts and provisions for transgression, More has a number of other things written into his expectations about the world. First of all, there will be slavery. Not slavery of people, not people who are coerced into slavery, but rather people who are given slavery as a punishment for deeds they themselves committed, which would be given death in any other society. In other words, think about it this way. More was an essentially just and generous and kind-hearted man, but he was also a practical politician. He had spent a great deal of time as a judge, and a remarkably honest judge. He was well known for his refusal to take bribes in an age when taking bribes was not unusual for a case. And what More did, upon reflection, is say to himself, you know, I'm not sure that the society that I'm upholding is in fact a good society. More, for example, at the time that More is writing, the penalty for theft in England is death. And More says, I'm sure that I'm doing the right thing in convicting these people and in sentencing them to be hanged. Perhaps this is too hard a punishment. Perhaps the fault lies not in these people that I am condemning. Perhaps the fault lies in our institutions and in our laws and in the way society is organized. One of the great contributions that More makes to the traditions of Western political thought is the idea that maybe society shares some of the blame for the practical evils that we find in our system of laws and courts. And More wants to try and solve some of these problems. One way he intends to solve these problems is in Utopia, there are no lawyers. And I think he may be right about that. Yes, no lawyers are allowed in Utopia. It's not at all surprising. He said any law worth having is one that everybody understands. And everybody understands it. There's really no point in having some lawyer mess around with it and twist it. Look, come and speak for yourself. The magistrates are remarkable for their probity and honesty, and they don't need prosecuting and defending attorneys. Say what you have to say, and the magistrate managed to pick out the truth, which matters in utopian courts. In addition to not having any lawyers, the laws are very simple and few, and that way everyone understands what laws govern them. More thinks it a very evil thing back in Renaissance England that most people didn't know what laws they were obeying. Look at the laws now. We don't know what laws we obey either. It has the same sort of characteristic defects, and it succumbs to the same sort of criticism. What kind of law is it that I'm obligated to obey if I don't understand what it is? So More says, I want few laws, I want everyone to understand them, and I want everyone to talk for themselves. This way, we avoid a great deal of the evil that is built into a legal system, and we come closer to meeting the standards of truth, and for More, that is going to be of utmost concern. So there's going to be no sorts of lawyers, there are going to be few courts, and in addition to having few courts and few lawyers, it also turns out that there is always hope. People are not sentenced to death except for those that have repeatedly offended. There's nothing we can do with them. More dislikes the death penalty, but he sees it as a regrettable necessity under certain circumstances. Instead, he says, we will punish them by making them slaves. He calls them bondmen. They are given a period of time in which they are forced to do onerous and menial and unpleasant tasks. But the possibility is always there that if they behave themselves, and if they do not transgress further, and if they bear their punishment properly with the proper understanding of their chastisement, they may be released from their bondage and reintegrated into society. This is a groping towards the idea of rehabilitation, the idea that people's sins can be repented of, the idea of forgiveness, which is central to Christianity, has been built right into this legal system. But a legal system has to be constructed because sin is there and it's there for good. So More is walking a fine line between Athens and Jerusalem, between his hope for human perfection and his understanding that it is impossible to completely perfect society. That's one of the great legacies of the tradition that comes out of Jerusalem. Now, in addition to these ideas about laws, there are several important ideas about pleasure and religion. Hedonism is advocated by utopians, but only within the bounds of Scripture and only within the bounds of reason. On the other hand, there is a certain degree of asceticism which is exclusively the product of religion. There are two groups of people who engage in public service as a means to glorify God, and they do it because they think that by sacrificing things in this world, by sacrificing worldly pleasures, they will get transcendental rewards, and that God will favor that sort of behavior. What they do is this, these two groups of people, one, the more worldly but still hardly profane, one group eats meat and gets married and does various kinds of difficult public service. The other kind remains chaste. They do not eat meat, they only eat vegetable food, and they are thought of as being holier, but not quite as wise as the ones that allow for a certain degree of human creature comforts. The point here is this, though. By inventing this category of people that are especially blessed and especially devoted towards divinity, who do practically good things in this world, he is answering the criticisms that had been leveled against medieval monasticism. What More is doing is saying, devoting yourself to God is a fine thing. Giving up on worldly cares and on profane and day-to-day concerns, that is an admirable thing. But to do it exclusively within the domain of a cloister and to have no practical effect on the world around you is by itself not the best way of devoting yourself to God. There's a wonderful line, I think it's the point of Plato's Euthyphro, where he says, piety is honor to God by service to men. It's a very fine idea. Well, I think that what More is driving at here is that his bondmen will be doing honor to God by doing service to men, not by just praying within the cloister. It is a practical kind of virtue, and that's what More is driving us towards. So in one sense, he is a child of not just the Renaissance, but also the classical tradition. He wants people to practically do things in this world. At the same time, he is not neglecting the spiritual side of things. He says the way in which you can best give honor to God is by helping human beings. So he's answering the criticism that had been leveled by some people about the inutility of monasticism without undermining the intent behind it. The spiritual purification that one gets from that can also be gotten from practical things in this world. Now, in addition to borrowing things like that, he borrows the just war doctrine from Aquinas. Christians on the whole are not very violent, at least in a theological sense, and yet there have been certain Christian thinkers who have tried to sketch out the circumstances under which violence is permissible or perhaps a moral obligation. This is the idea of a just war. Wars of aggression are unjust, but wars of defense are, for example, just. More picks this doctrine up, and the Utopians, while they hate war, will in fact go to war if they are sufficiently provoked. And they will go to war under three circumstances. One, to defend themselves. Two, to defend a friendly country. And this is not the same thing as a country with which they have a treaty. The Utopians do not sign treaties because they do not trust them. They said if you're going to be honest and peaceful, you wouldn't bother to write a treaty up at all. On the other hand, if you were being duplicitous and dishonest and corrupt, then you write up a treaty and break it. So what's the point of writing up treaties? We just don't invade people. Get used to it. So the Utopians only go to war if they are invaded. If someone with whom they have friendly relations, if they are invaded, they will help defend against an aggressor. And third, to deliver a weak state from tyranny. They will also go to war for that, only so that good moral ends can be achieved. They do not engage in wars of aggression. They do not engage in wars of conquest. What we get in Utopia is, if you can stop and think about it, in some ways a giant coeducational monastery. It is a very strict and very religious sort of a life that is carefully kept within limited rules, and yet these rules do not completely drive people towards otherworldliness, do not completely drive people towards asceticism. More, in some ways, has one foot in the Middle Ages and one foot in the Renaissance, and in some ways he's straddling the line between the two. He has that same yearning for perfect stasis, for a perfectly well-ordered society, for a moral society, and if that were to happen, society would freeze up. He longs for that perfect, undynamic stasis. Now, one more thing before I go on to the text of the book itself. What is left out in More's Utopia is in some ways as important as what gets put in. It is worth noting that in More's Utopia there is no noble lie. Those of you who know Plato's Republic know that the rulers have to lie to the ruled in order to get them to do what they're supposed to do. Because there's such a great vast distinction between the gold class and the bronze class that they can only communicate by a noble lie or a useful myth. That doesn't happen in More's Utopia. And here's the reason why. All human beings are equal in the sight of God. Human equality as an important value in Western political thought is closely, inextricably bound up with the history of Christianity. It is impossible for there to be such a gulf between the rulers and the ruled that we would need a special set of myths in a Christian commonwealth. That is only going to happen in a Platonic world where God isn't there to equalize all human nature. Now, let's look at the book itself. There are two parts to the book. The first was actually written last. The first part is called the Dialogue of Counsel, and that's where we get introduced to Raphael Hithalidae. He's a mariner who has been across the world. He has a wide knowledge of geography and politics, and he's an exceptionally learned man for a practical man, and that's the key focus there. The Renaissance emphasis on a man being able to do all things, to be both an explorer and a political theorist and a practical politician. All of them are brought together in Raphael. But strangely enough, it turns out that Raphael, the key figure in More's Utopia, has a rather contemplative rather than practical preference. He has been a mariner, he's been all around the world, and in particular, he has been to Utopia. And he's the one who's going to come back and tell us what Utopia is like. And he says, look, in this Dialogue of Counsel, the first part of the book, More and one of the other hearers of Raphael say, well, look, since you're such an intelligent fellow, since you're so learned and well-traveled and so well-schooled, you should be working for a king or a prince or someone so that you could give good advice in statecraft and so that we could have good practical politics here in Europe now. And Raphael says, no, I do not think that is the case. In fact, the active life would only get me killed and I could do no one any good. And then they give a couple of examples. He says, for example, the case of theft being a capital crime. Raphael says, look, capital punishment for theft is far too great a sentence. In fact, it causes people to commit murders they wouldn't commit because they have nothing to lose. But in addition to that, it's simply unjust and unkind and lacking in mercy. He says the problem with your society lies not in the fact that you have theft, but lies in the fact that you have gold and silver, and you have greed and luxury. And that's what causes theft. The cause of theft is the improper organization of society, at least for most of the cases. And for you to be proud of giving out so many death sentences about theft is a terrible evil. Your understanding of right and wrong has been corrupted by the corrupt society in which you live. He also says, look, suppose I were to be in the council of a king, and the various advisors to a king were to say, I think you should expand your domain in this way, and another one were to give him another way to expand his domain, and a third were to come up with a third way to expand the domain. Raphael said, I would tell him nothing of the kind. I would tell him, your kingdom is exactly the right size right now, and that you have a hard enough job in governing this state well. Rather than add anything to your state, why don't you do a better job with what you have? And the auditors say, well, yeah, you're right about that. No one's going to listen to you. If you are a minister of state and you tell an ambitious, proud ruler that he should do a better job with what he has rather than trying to extend his domain, no one will listen to you. You will find yourself in hot water. After 2 or 3 examples come up like this, they are grudgingly inclined to say, yeah, you're probably right. It may be that a good man cannot give good advice in politics. It could be that the way of the world is such that Machiavellian leaders and Machiavellian advisors are the ones that get heated. Perhaps it is best for a man to make his feelings and opinions known through the medium of lovely dialogues like this. Keep in mind Thomas More's actual life when you do this. This book is written while More is away in the Netherlands on a diplomatic mission, and he is thinking about entering the king's service for the remainder of his life, and he doesn't want to. It is very clear that More wants to go back to the library, right, and read more sacred books, and he would like to think a lot, and he would also be willing to do something to earn a living, say be an honest judge or something like that, but he doesn't want to be the Chancellor of England, which is something like being the Prime Minister of England. Because he desperately does not want this job, naturally he gets it. So he's stuck being an advisor to Henry VIII, who is not remarkable for his, how can I put it, for his saintliness. So in some respects, the difficulties that Raphael is gesturing at here in the first part of Utopia are in fact the same difficulties that More himself will find when he goes into practical politics. And particularly working for someone like Henry VIII, you can see how many difficulties he is going to encounter and how he is going to do this in some ways for platonic reasons, not because he himself wants this kind of power, but rather because if he doesn't, someone worse will end up doing this. Entirely possible. So he takes his position. And while meditating on these problems, he generates the second half of the book while he's away on this diplomatic mission. And we find here the details of utopian life are remarkably like a perfect England. It turns out that Utopia is an island, just like England. And it turns out it has a large capital city, which is remarkably like London, and it's next to a river that's remarkably like the Thames. Are you getting the picture here? He is not suggesting that we can perfect England, but rather that this is what England would be if its corruptions were eliminated. It gives us a yardstick by which to judge contemporary politics. Now, there are 54 cities, and they are of roughly identical size, and they have roughly identical buildings. Apparently there's not much innovation in architecture, and all the people wear roughly identical clothes. This is a utopia that would only appeal to someone that comes out of that tradition of Christian asceticism. In other words, there's not much variety, there's not much entertainment value, at least insofar as we might think of things like architecture or dress or paintings as being valuable independent of, religious limitations. More was very strict about the religious limitations he would impose on this. If you want lovely clothes, that's an example of vanity. Religion will not allow that. If you want a house that's better than other people's, religion will not allow that as well. Do not be house proud, be soul proud. So More says his 54 cities, which are largely identical with identical buildings, is his idea of a perfect society. And within these cities, politics is organized in a hierarchical way that he thinks mirrors the natural hierarchy of society. The family is the minimal unit of society, and the eldest male speaks for the whole family. This is important. The idea of the individual as being the minimal unit of society, that's not going to become important until the Enlightenment. We don't have a thoroughgoing idea, a robust idea of individuality yet. So we still have the oldest male head of household, the paterfamilias, as representing the entire family, which in this case numbers about 30 people. We have several generations together. An old-fashioned extended conception of the family as well. Now, each 30 families gets together and they elect a magistrate called a phylarch, and then the phylarchs get together and they choose another magistrate above them called the tranabor. And in addition, there is a prince that rules the entire society, and he is elected by the phylarchs. Here's the key idea. These magistrates are remarkable, first of all, for their intelligence. The Utopians love knowledge. They spend almost all their time thinking and reading and studying. This is quite a utopian society. So the phylarchs are very honest. They're remarkable for their honesty and for their intelligence. And in addition to that, we assume that they will choose virtuous princes, so they will not get us involved in foreign escapades. Very much different from the hereditary monarch he works for. Think about the implicit criticism there. Who would vote for Henry VIII? If you had a choice, you would likely vote for somebody else. So what he's implicitly saying there is that hereditary monarchy contains many evils. I work for one of them. Right? Do not lose sight of that. What he says and what he does not say are often very damning. Now, in terms of the economy, he's also quite intriguing there. He emphasizes the labor theory of value, which is going to become so important when you study Locke later on, or when you study people like Hobbes. In English political economy, the labor theory of value, the idea that all valuable things in the world come from work, is going to be very important. It actually has utopian and Christian roots. Money is abolished. Instead, gold and silver are used for chamber pots in order to bring them into disrepute. And in addition to that, gemstones are given to babies because they're shiny and pretty. The idea being that children naturally give up the things of infancy as they get a little bit older and smarter. The idea is that he wants to bring gold and silver and gems into disrepute. The Utopians use no money at all. They are beyond commerce. The point is that their markets, nothing gets sold. They're large storehouses, and everybody, or every male head of household, comes every day or every week whenever he needs supplies and is given whatever he wants in whatever quantity he wants, because no one hoards anything, because there'll be plenty more there when you go back next week. There's no need for people to be covetous. There is no need for greed. They don't have to pay anything for it, just bring home what you need. So everyone brings home what they need. All 30 families eat together in large communal meals. It creates community feeling, but also allows elder people to supervise the younger. When people sit down to dinner, it's always an odd, even mix of the elder and the younger, and the elder and the younger. That means that the young people never get out of hand at dinner. They never become boisterous or difficult because they always have their elders on both sides of them. There's no place to go. So decorum is maintained. The food is wonderful. It saves a great deal of time, and people have the burden of oppression lifted from them in many respects. They don't have to take care of their own little nuclear family, whether they can or not. Everyone gets fed. He thinks this is quite consistent with Christian religious tradition. In addition to that, everyone has to work. Very important. More lives at a time when you have landed aristocracy. There are people who sit on their butts and don't do anything. And they have a whole crew of retainers behind them that do nothing but get into trouble. And then there's, of course, a large chunk of society which has to work 6 days a week, 12 and 14 hours a day, to support themselves and the rest of society in luxury. More wants to abolish that. He says, look, if you don't work, you don't eat. Everyone in More's Utopia has a skill or a trade. Most of them have two. And because everyone works, they are able to reduce the workday to 6 hours a day. In other words, he is looking to be kind and merciful towards all people and to remove the inequalities and oppression that are characteristic of the society he finds himself in. He says, only by making everyone work and by expecting everyone to work can we make everyone have a happy and productive life. No one is covetous because they always have what they need. They can't get other kinds of clothing. There's only one style. They can't get other kinds of house. People aren't even allowed to maintain their own households. Each family will stay in its house for 10 years. At the end of 10 years, they all change houses. The idea being that no one gets too attached to things of this world. I don't know in practice that it's such a good idea, but in theory, he's gesturing at the idea that we should not be too caught up in things of this world. Instead, what we should do is try and move our thoughts from this world to the next. For that reason, prior to their 6-hour workday, the Utopians like to go to lectures. Every morning, they get up at 5, I believe, and they sit and listen to their lectures. Would that I had such undergraduates. But no, it doesn't turn out that way. The Utopians love it. Those that aren't inclined towards learning do a little extra work. People approve of that. Those who may become eminent in learning are, by common consent, turned into phylarchs and tranibors and the magistrates of the society. Their ambassadors are drawn from the scholarly class, and their and the priests are drawn from the scholarly class. More makes a very telling remark somewhere in Utopia where he says, they have priests of exceeding holiness and therefore very few. Yes, indeed, they have very, very holy priests, and as a result, of course, they have very few of them. And also women can be priests in More's Utopia. The idea being that sex is not a barrier towards holiness. Key thing here is this. These changes in society, we hold on to the old hierarchies, but we give up our attachment to things of this world. We give up on the idea that a happy life is one where you get the most stuff. The happy life is the one in which you are most closely connected to God, in which you do not transgress and do not engage in any evil towards your fellow man. That can only be done if everyone works and everyone pitches in. A nice and in some ways quite inspiring idea. Certainly later utopian socialist thinkers are going to derive a lot of their ammunition from this kind of thinking. Foreign policy, the utopians hate war and avoid it when they can, but when they have to have a war, they do it and they go in to win. Since they have been keeping their money in reserve, they don't use any money, they don't use gold or silver or gems, they can pay mercenaries the largest possible wages. And they think that it's a great thing because they say that any group of people that will professionally kill people should be encouraged to go get themselves killed. He says that would be a benefit to the entire human race. If we just get them to all kill each other, the utopians will pay for it. So we'll give money to both sides, have them all kill each other. And remember, we only have to pay half the people because only half of them are coming back. Right? So we can really afford to give them a very good wage. So the mercenaries, who are in this case a gesture towards the Swiss, because at More's time the Swiss were the most famous mercenaries in Europe. He thinks mercenaries and any mercenary people should be gotten rid of as soon as possible, and this is a good reason to keep gold and silver away from the populace, because you always have this tremendous treasure trove. In addition to that, when they engage in a war, they always put a large bounty on the head of their enemy, and they really pay it, because they found this to be a very easy way of winning a war. Put $1 million on the opposing king's head and put $100,000 on all of his ministers. See how long that society lasts. That society has gold and silver and greed and corruption. They can't do that with the utopian people. The utopians would laugh at them at such a suggestion. Now, in religion, beyond their foreign policy, their religion is quite interesting. They have brought Christianity in recently because they hadn't had access to it prior to that. But they had managed to work out what we might call deistical or natural religion on their own. They had an idea of a creator. They had worked out certain of the ideas of natural religion that we saw in the tradition of Greco-Roman antiquity. But they had been arrested at that phase of development until Christianity comes in. Once Christianity comes in, it begins to make very quick and very powerful inroads. So at the time that Hippolyta is describing Utopia, it is not a unified Christian society, but it has been very open to accepting the Christian message. And that should not be any surprise given the uncorrupted state of utopian institutions and laws and ideas. Now the question is, why would More construct a utopia along these lines? In other words, what's the attraction of this static, rather humdrum, perfect world? What is it that More is running from? Because it seems clear enough that he's not looking towards the future. It's not like a modern utopia which hopes that we will be delivered by science or technology or something else along those lines. It is not forward-looking. More's utopia is essentially a backward-looking gesture at the stasis of medieval Europe. It may not have been just, it may not have been perfect, but at least stayed the way it was. More was living at a time when the New World has just been discovered, and tremendous scientific and technological and religious changes are underway. And undergirding all of those changes is what we might call the rise of commercial capitalism in the West. And this is what scares him. More talks in the beginning of the book about the sheep that eat men. And what he's doing there is referring to the enclosure movement. That was a movement in English economics and politics which drove people off the land and allowed people to engage in the large-scale wool trade. More described these as the sheep that eat men. They eat men because they drive people off the land where they can't eat anymore, and the sheep flourish, but people go to cities and die. Terrible evils are being committed, and More, being a judge, is forced to put these people to death as a result. He says, no more shall sheep eat men. No more will commerce drive us into evil. In fact, we will restrict our desire for commerce and business and money so that we can achieve morality and political order. So what he wants to do is essentially abolish commerce. So in a utopian society, there's no gold, there's no silver, there's no merchants, and there's nothing in the way of exchange for gain. He thinks that when we can get rid of exchange for gain, we will have eliminated not all of human evil, but the greatest predisposition towards human evil. And those other evils that are left, once we create these utopian institutions, well, that residue will be what is left over due to the imperfectibility of human beings. In other words, what's left over after you have a perfect society is sin. All the evils that are still there will be the product of original sin, not the product of human transgression. So what More is saying in Utopia is something along these lines. He's summarizing the entire tradition of Western political philosophy, but he's not a forward-looking thinker who says, this is the next great step. He's rather saying that we should take a step backwards from where we are. He's saying that the idea of sheep-eating men means that our society is disordered, and our understanding of right and wrong is disordered. Probably the best way to read More's Utopia is as a book of nostalgia for the stasis of the Middle Ages. And although it is in some respects also a Jeremiad, a criticism of the present state of society, in fact, his conservatism was insufficient to lead Western Europe into the next stage of political and religious development. His conservatism was backward-looking, and his ideas were inadequate to the job of getting us beyond this fixed and static view of the world. The next great achievement in political and moral thinking in the West will have to forge a new set of ideas and a new set of forward-looking thoughts. This new set of forward-looking thoughts will be only a few years after Thomas More, and these new forward-looking conceptions will be found in the work of Martin Luther.